In this video we'll talk about how to collect Warhammer 40k while hopefully saving a little bit of money while doing so. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're all about getting the most miniatures on the tabletop for the least amount of money. The prices on Games Workshop's most recent releases have been hitting some new highs recently, so I thought it'd be a good idea to revisit some tactics to get cool miniatures on the tabletop without costing you quite as much. I know price isn't necessarily the biggest issue for everyone, but it can be a massive barrier to getting into the hobby. So with that in mind, we're going to talk through 10 of the ways that I personally have saved money in playing 40k, not all of which might be obvious to newer players, and you're not likely to hear about much discussion on the subject from Games Workshop themselves. So first up, we have Games Workshop discounts, possibly one of the most obvious ways of saving money on miniatures. Certain boxes released from Games Workshop will cost less than the price of the kits individually. There are the Start Collecting boxes, the Recruit and Elite starter sets for Space Marines and Necrons in 9th edition, and these new Combat Patrol boxes which we've talked about recently on the channel that give a bit of a discount compared with buying kits individually. If I was starting to get into any one army, I would certainly be looking out for any of these deals on the faction that I was collecting, though I'd bear in mind that it is often only a discount if you did want all the models in the box. Sometimes it might just be worth buying the kit that you actually want, as opposed to a whole load of things that are discounted, but you don't really. I'd say some of Games Workshop's very best discounts are often limited edition ones that only stick around for a while before disappearing. The most recent example was this Indomitus box, which for Games Workshop standards, despite being fairly hefty in terms of price, was about one of the best deals that they've ever done in terms of the amount of miniatures for the amount of money that you pay. I'm kind of sad that this one didn't stick around for longer. Other pretty decent value boxes in recent years are Shadow Spear, Tooth and Claw with Space Marines against Genestealer Cult, and the Christmas box sets, hopefully some of which will be materialising soon. I always keep an eye out for these, and depending on the exact kit in question, I'll often pick them up. Secondly, discount retailers. These vary heavily depending on exactly where you live in the world as to whether or not anywhere stocks Games Workshop products at a discount from RRP. In the UK, we're quite fortunate. There's multiple big retailers that give you 10 to 20% off Games Workshop products, and it has always felt a little bit strange to me that buying Warhammer directly from the store Games Workshop is quite significantly more expensive than these third-party sellers. There are many and varied options in the UK, including all manner of great local stores. One I do recommend is Element Games. I've never had any trouble ordering through them, and I do have a link to them in the video description below if you're interested. I know similar places exist in many other places around the world as well. I'd just Google discount Warhammer and your country's name and see if any likely online retailers crop up. It's particularly nice when you're already buying the discounted sets such as Start Collecting boxes through these, as then you're sort of doubling down on the money that you get off the kits. If you do have a local gaming store, I would strongly consider supporting them. If you'd find it useful for the place to stay open, then I would try and buy Warhammer from them when possible. Generally though, I only buy from Games Workshop directly when there's a very good reason to, such as wanting to get something extra fast from release date, limited availability, or some items that you can only purchase directly through them. Next, I'm a big fan of eBay and second-hand miniatures. First of all, if you have no interest at all in models that people have already assembled, typically any miniature that's appeared in a big discount box set will generally be going on eBay for less than the prices that you'd buy at Games Workshop or these discount sellers. One example recently is with Indomitus with the Marines and Necrons. If you wanted to pick up some Blade Guard veterans or Scorpec destroyers, then eBay is likely going to be the cheapest place that you're going to be able to. This basically happens with every single discounted kit that Games Workshop have. For example, Primaris Intercessors, the full multi-part plastic kit, will often go a lot cheaper because they're in so many discount boxes, so people might be selling them off because they already have plenty of them. If you are wanting to do Warhammer on a budget though, then typically buying assembled and painted miniatures will cost you a lot less than buying new plastic kits. It was how I got my fairly sizable guard collection together throughout university. You have to be somewhat patient and a little bit flexible as to what sort of things that you're willing to pick up, but it's usually very possible to get a lot of older Warhammer miniatures at half price or less. With eBay, the main things to look out for are paint and assembly issues. Ideally, you want to have good pictures of the miniatures and them not to be too caked in paint so it's easy to repaint them, but I find that most miniatures are fairly salvageable with a little bit of work. For truly paint-caked things, you can think about stripping them and repainting, and most thinly painted things, I'm very happy just to paint straight over, you barely notice the difference. If you really don't care too much about exactly what you're picking up though, then buying entire armies off eBay can give you even further price discounts, just because there's less competition for some guy's random collection of Space Marines. In addition to eBay, I'd also think about people selling in the local area. There's often a bit of a turnover with armies at local clubs, so keep your ear to the ground there. There's various Facebook buying and selling and trading groups, and you can think about local internet adverts, things like Gumtree in the UK. You don't see too much Warhammer go on there, but I found a few things that I bought from time to time. I'll admit that the next bit is a bit of personal preference, but personally I'm not such a big a fan of many of the accessory items that Games Workshop sells alongside miniatures. Don't get me wrong, a lot of these can be really fun, and often Games Workshop items are really good quality, but they do tend to be a bit overpriced for what they actually are. If you want to do Warhammer on a budget, typically I'd focus on the miniatures and paints rather than any extras. For example, faction-specific dice go for £20 or $35 at the moment, where you can easily buy more dice online for a quarter of the price. I'm not the biggest fan of the upgrade sprues. They do add some cool character to your miniatures, but they cost so much for the plastic that they actually provide you. They're absolutely tiny. And some of the painting accessories, such as these modelling clippers and the themed Citadel water pot, cost you a lot more than you could get from other sources. I'd be very tempted to pick up brushes, clippers and paint pots and things from craft stores, local hobby shops, or just ordering them in over the internet. For me, I've always just compared with the amount of miniatures that I could buy for the same cost, and usually I've always wanted more miniatures compared with slightly fancier dice. Next, I consider the odd tactical kitbash or conversion where it could potentially save you a lot of money. Games Workshop really has quite a lot of miniatures that you could up value by turning another unit into said unit, or perhaps just building it out of spare bits and scrap. A great example of this are orc looted vehicles and weapons. A particular bad point for Games Workshop value are the orc mech guns, around about 30 to 50 points of miniature in game, and they cost you around about £30. I bought a box of Gretchen and basically just made some mech guns out of scrap with a little bit of flavour added from orc bits that I had lying around from other kits. I wound up building 4 of these and saved myself around about £100 over buying them directly from Games Workshop. I'll admit that they don't look quite as cool as the ones from Games Workshop, but building them was really good fun, and in all honesty I'm quite happy to have slightly less finished looking miniatures and save lots and lots of money. Another example that Games Workshop themselves showed off recently was a custom Catan shard that someone had made for their army. They used a big orb of creepy looking metal to represent a shattered necrodermis. I think it was really cool, and can be a good stand-in to maybe represent a different Catan shard on the battlefield. Flayed ones I'm sure will be quite expensive when their new kit comes out. It might be worth converting some warriors into them. With the addition of some creepy knives and blades, I'm sure you can make some suitable stand-ins should you want to. Finally, I think one of the biggest ways of adding value are Space Marine characters. Character models can often go for about 5 times the price of a regular infantryman without necessarily being all that different in aesthetics. In particular, if you can get your hands on some bodies with robes or just looking slightly more blingy than your standard Space Marine, then you can go to town with other spare parts and make some custom characters almost for free. I've mentioned these before on the channel, but these custom Smash Captains that I made have pretty much done the job for me, and I also made some similar librarians out of the same robe bodies and some hooded heads, and I think that you could certainly do the same for some Primaris Captains and Lieutenants, maybe using bits of Blade Guard for example. There's nothing to stop you doing this for special characters as well. With a little bit of an alternate take and having war gear that looks pretty much the same, you could get away with quite a lot. In general, kit bashing is quite a fun part of the hobby. It's particularly worth it to the wallet if the kits are expensive in the first place, and generally when people see cool alternate models like these, you get a good reaction from them. Generally people like to see cool custom models on the table. Next, when buying miniatures, I strongly consider how much each miniature is really worth it to you, and I try and pass up on some of the worst deals from Games Workshop that are exorbitant for one reason or another. Certainly in recent years, Games Workshop's pricing has got a bit silly, and there's quite a lot of kits that personally I would under no circumstances bother getting. I think the value of a miniature kit to someone is somewhere between the look and feel of the models, how much plastic you get per pound or dollar invested, how many in-game points you get, and how often you're realistically going to use that miniature in-game. Any one of those could just be a really good reason to get it, such as if you just really love the new Necron Monolith kit, then there is a good enough reason to get it even if it does cost £105, and perhaps under the current rules you might not play it in the game quite so much. Still though, if a kit ticks most of these boxes, then it's usually going to be a better deal, and if it ticks none of them, I'd be very tempted not to pick it up. Going back to the last example, Orc Mech Guns are one of these. It's a cool looking kit and one that I'd use in game quite regularly. But if you wanted to have Orc Mech Guns as a fairly decent part of your army, you'd need quite a lot of them, because you just get so little points per the amount of money that you invest. Kits like these just turn me off a bit, and I also rarely buy any of the new fancy character releases, just because they're relatively expensive and you don't really get all that much plastic for your money. I would also bear in mind that some entire armies are going to cost you a lot more than others. Genestealer Cult are one particularly bad example. This Acolyte kit, while being quite cool and quite flexible, really isn't going to get you very far in game. Genestealer cult tend to be a bit hoardy, so you're going to need a lot of these very expensive kits to get an army off the ground. I think you could say fairly similarly for things like Admech and Imperial Guard, both of which tend to have fairly cheap units at fairly high prices, whereas more elite armies such as Space Marines and Custodes just have a lower entry cost into how much money you need to spend to get a full list working. While I'm sure Games Workshop don't like this, there are many other third-party sellers that make miniatures, and many of them try and make things that are fairly similar to Games Workshop products in the hope that people will buy them just because they like the looks, or often just as a cheaper alternative. Naturally, they won't call them Space Marines or Imperial Guardsmen, they'll use similar wording, and they can be a really interesting option to look into for certain expensive Games Workshop kits. One example that I was quite a big fan of was this Cromlech Legionary Heavy Weapons platform, which to all intents and purposes is quite clearly trying to be a Thunderfire cannon or quad mortar. It's significantly cheaper than Games Workshop's resin Thunderfire cannon. Admittedly, you don't get the Tech Marine with it, so you'd have to kitbash something to stand in. But what swung it for me was the fact that the Games Workshop Thunderfires were out of stock, and you could basically get 2 of these for the price of one Games Workshop Thunderfire. Sometimes with a little bit of conversion work, you can make them look a little bit more Warhammer-like, maybe adding a few spare armor plates from other Space Marine vehicles for example. And besides whole models, these guys also make quite a bunch of interesting parts, such as different Guard Regiment heads and things, which could be a potential cheaper alternative to Death Corps of Krieg, and they often sell alternate weapon options that they try and make sort of compatible with Games Workshop's kits. I would be aware that Games Workshop themselves are likely to take a bit of a dim view of these if you do try and turn up to play in their stores, but unless you're playing in an actual Games Workshop and the thing is actually a decent stand-in for a Games Workshop miniature, most of the time you should be fine. Next we have a trap that a lot of people fall into, which is buying more miniatures than you could ever realistically assemble and paint yourself. I'm afraid this is a trap that I have fallen into a bit myself, and something that I am trying to cut down on. I think for me, perhaps my experience with eBay, and knowing that I could resell any of these kits when I want to, has sort of made me a bit more blasé about it. Generally though, maintaining a big pile of shame with a lot of unbuilt miniatures is not a very clever idea. If you haven't even got them out of the box and assembled them, then they're not going to be going anywhere near the tabletop, and they may as well be back in the shop. If you do have a serious backlog, rules can change, interest can wane, and models can even get updated by the time that you finish them. And by the time you actually come to sort out the miniatures, you could certainly wind up reselling for a loss. I know it might be easier said than done, but in general I would make pains not to have more than a couple of unopened kits at a time, even with Games Workshop's frenetic release schedule always giving us newer and more shiny things. Honestly, there have been a lot of times when I've resisted the urge to start an army or buy a new kit, looked back in a couple of months' time and realised that I really wouldn't have used it all that much. Generally, if you know that any sort of rules update is near on the horizon, it's often going to be a good idea to wait for buying a given kit until after that. Next we have the added extra expense of rulebooks, which from Games Workshop can be quite significant. For picking up a copy of the core rules, I strongly consider the Command Starter Set, or potentially picking up a copy of the softback book off eBay, where people who have bought the Command Starter Set are selling it on. For the actual faction that I'm playing, I'd start with that faction's codex and no more at that point. If you really do want other supplements such as the Psychic Awakening books or other less core things, then I'd wait till a little bit further down the line. Currently, for everything that isn't Space Marines and Necrons, and you don't have a codex coming out in the next couple of months, you might seriously consider the Warhammer 40k app. It does cost a bit at £5 a month, but honestly, if it saves you buying a couple of £25 codexes, then it's really quite a good deal. I'll be honest that when I had the 40k app and I realised that it really did give you all the rules that you needed to play the game with, I basically just sold all of my codexes en masse from 8th edition, as I know that they're going to be updated in 9th at some point. Unless you like to keep them for the lore or just look through old edition rules, then I really would consider selling codexes and rulebooks early as soon as you know that there's going to be a new update. Any sort of demand for them is really going to wane as soon as the update drops. On top of that, some books just are really barely worth getting in the first place. Sometimes Games Workshop releases supplements that only have a couple of pages of rules for one faction, and they might charge a lot for the book. I think that the Vigilus books are one good example of this, where say if you wanted to play Admech, there were only 2 formations in the Vigilus book, rules that you could pretty much remember off the top of your head if you needed to, and I personally wouldn't have picked it up. Finally, again whether or not Games Workshop like it, Warhapedia and Battlescribe both exist. They basically give you free access to the vast majority of the game's rules. I'm a bit unsure as to their exact legal standing. I suspect they might be cutting in on Games Workshop's rights for other people not to publish their stuff, but they don't seem to have been able to do anything about them for years on years from a legal perspective, and they can be a really valuable resource when list building or planning on jumping into a new army. Honestly, I suspect that the easy access to rules actually does Games Workshop more good than harm. Finally, for people who have made it this far into the video, here are a few rapid fire bonus things that I thought would be worth including. Magnets are far better than buying duplicates of any one kit. Simple things to change include power weapons and things, certain guns on tanks, and being able to take sponsons on or off at will. And if you are planning on being into Warhammer for the long term, then making your miniatures able to swap out weapons could be really good for when the rules inevitably change. When you buy Warhammer kits, I'd keep any spare bits for future conversions, keep them in some sort of well-organised way. It can be a really valuable resource in the future. Say when you want to re-arm a dreadnought with a couple of las cannons, you might well already have the parts available without having to buy off bit sellers or buy an entire extra model. I think it's a really big asset to be able to use eBay, particularly to resell miniatures. It makes any of those big value discount kits just so much more appealing. Say if there was a value kit with a character, some aggressors and some intercessors, and you just wanted the aggressors and intercessors, then being able to resell the character could actually save you a lot of money by not picking up a miniature that you didn't need and getting even further discounts on that kit. It can also be pretty handy for any miniatures that you're pretty sure that you won't use anymore. Pairing off a couple of obsolete options from a collection might not be the worst idea. Transport-wise, I tend to prefer a very low-tech solution myself. I've never bought any of the Games Workshop fancy carry cases. Instead, I've invested in some varnish to make sure miniatures don't chip paint easily, and I use bubble wrap and put them in some sturdy plastic boxes. It depends on exactly what sort of miniatures you've got. Sturdy Space Marines or Guardsmen without too many pointy bits are generally not too bad for this, though you might want to be a bit more careful with some spindly Eldar or more fragile miniatures. Finally, when building up a Warhammer collection, I generally aim not to resell entire armies if you are thinking about staying with the game. I know it's quite a common practice for people to sell an army and buy another one, and it can give you a bit more experience, plus all the fun of assembling and painting them. But usually when you resell entire armies, you'll get a lot less for them compared with it when you bought them in the first place, and you lose all the time and effort involved in getting the army together and getting them looking nice on the table. I really enjoy having multiple armies on the go, and it really can be quite fun when a new edition drops and all the rules change again. It might easily breathe a new lease of life into a faction that was really not that fun in the previous game. In general, I try and just put them in storage, and only actually sell if time or space becomes an issue, or you really are leaving the hobby for good. So I hope some of those have been some use to you guys. I know a lot of it will be fairly obvious stuff to veteran hobbyists, but I'm hoping for new people that might have shed some light on some areas that they might not have been familiar with. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, and if you're looking for discount models in the UK, feel free to check out that Element Games affiliate link down in the video description. It does help to support the channel. And finally, if you think that I might have saved you a bit of money with these tips, I would just like to mention that there's a Patreon page down in the video description as well, if you'd like to say thank you and support the channel a little. Making all of these videos does take a fair amount of time, so any support is massively appreciated. If you do fancy giving it a look, then channel patrons get to see videos early each week, there's regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and you also get entered into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.